Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The United States and the Armenian Genocide, History, Memory, Politics, by Julien Zarifian. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. The year 2021 marked the long-awaited unequivocal recognition of the Armenian Genocide by the executive branch of the United States, through the voice of President Joseph Biden. It followed recognition by the legislative branch in 2019 through non-binding resolutions approved by the House of Representatives and the Senate. These two political decisions brought an end to 5 decades of wavering by the U.S. government, which could be identified as a policy of non-recognition of the genocide of 1915, perpetrated by the Turkish Ottoman authorities, and which eliminated the Armenian people from their ancestral homeland. This U.S. policy differed from the policy of active denial advanced by Turkey, but relayed the Turkish position. It amounted to a persistent and obstinate refusal to use the term genocide to characterize the massacres of 1915 to 1916, viewed as genocide by the vast majority of academics, intellectuals, international institutions, and countries with a stance on the matter. The radical political change on this question initiated in Congress in 2019 and concluded in 2021, contrasted with the executive branch's stance during the centennial of the genocide in 2015 under President Barack Obama, which can be considered as emblematic of the refusal by U.S. leadership to recognize the genocide and contribute to its full memorialization. Observed across the world, the many ceremonies that took place provided world leaders with the opportunity to publicly affirm or reaffirm the genocidal nature of the massacres of 1915 to 1916. Some of these leaders, including heads of state, speakers of parliament, ministers, members of parliaments, and religious leaders, came to Yerevan for the Genocide Remembrance Day, April 24th, to commemorate the genocide in Armenia. Others, like German President Joachim Gauck and Pope Francis, chose this special year to use publicly the term genocide to qualify the events for the first time, despite vocal opposition from the Republic of Turkey, the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, which has always denied that what happened to the Ottoman Armenians was genocide, and fought any international recognition of it. Following a policy established decades earlier, for this centennial, President Obama, who had promised to recognize the genocide while campaigning for the presidency in 2008, made a commemorative statement in which he avoided using the G word, and his administration sent to Armenia merely the Secretary of the Treasury, Jacob Lew, accompanied by 4 legislators. Meanwhile, on April 21st, Secretary of State John Kerry, himself a firm supporter of the Armenians when he was a senator, and Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, met in Washington, D.C., and, as expected, John Kerry did not mention the Armenian Genocide or the April 24th anniversary. This episode is emblematic of decades of U.S. policy regarding recognition of the genocide, a policy perceived as pro-Turkish to the chagrin of Armenians around the world, and, more significantly, Armenian Americans. However, the U.S. policy regarding what happened to the Armenians in 1915 has not always been such. When the genocide took place, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, was one of the nations most shocked by the massacres. Numerous reports by U.S. diplomats based in the Ottoman Empire, and especially Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, and hundreds of articles published in the U.S. press, were very explicit about the tragic fate of the Armenians of the empire, reiterating this sense of shock. The U.S. government and the general population became heavily involved in providing humanitarian aid and, to a lesser and more nuanced extent, political support to the Armenians. Although the term genocide had not yet been coined, the intentional, organized, and massive character of this crime against humanity was not questioned at this period, in the United States or elsewhere. However, U.S. support and its position in favor of the Armenians faded progressively throughout the 1920s and 1930s, after the creation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, preceded by the Soviet Union's creation in 1921. This support ceased completely with the beginning of the Cold War and the integration of Turkey into NATO in 1952. The Shoah and the conceptualization of the crime of genocide by jurist Raphael Lemkin, codified internationally in the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, also referred to as the Genocide Convention, had an effect on the Armenian issue. Many realized that the Armenian nation had suffered genocide, and it had been neglected and unjustly forgotten. Hitler himself, in 1939, said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Yet only in the 1960s did the Armenians really begin to fight collectively and massively, so that what they, their parents and grandparents had endured would not be forgotten, demanding firmly that Turkey and the world recognize that what occurred was genocide. This struggle began during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s to 1970s, and was primarily led by Armenian youth. It started with the organization of massive demonstrations throughout the world for the 50th anniversary of the genocide in April 1965, and took different forms, including mostly lobbying, but also paramilitary activities, seeking international recognition of the Armenian Genocide. Washington soon had to respond to this claim, and under the impulse of the executive branch, and especially the State Department, the U.S. federal government opted for an ambiguous policy of non-recognition of the genocide. Until 2021, the executive branch never used the term genocide to refer to the 1915 massacres, except in a couple of notable occasions, and systematically blocked attempts by Congress to pass legislation recognizing them as such. The main objective of this work is to examine the relationship the U.S. government and, to a lesser extent, U.S. society and media has had with the issue of the Armenian massacres of 1915 to 1916, from the perpetration of these crimes to their non-recognition as genocide in the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. I will analyze the reasons and mechanisms that have led the United States to be sensitive to the fate of Ottoman Armenians in the 1910s and 1920s, and occasionally to champion their cause, and its failure to recognize the events of 1915 to 1916 as genocide, from the 1960s to 1970s to the early 2020s, despite academic consensus to the contrary and growing international recognition. I will focus on the arguments and processes that have led the United States to maintain their decades-long position, making this case at the crossroads of U.S. foreign and domestic policies a remarkable example of continuity in U.S. policy. In other words, this study seeks to understand why and how the position of the United States, and especially the President and his cabinet, have evolved from a de facto recognition of the genocidal character of the Armenian massacres to an ambivalent policy of neutrality, which has been tantamount, for decades, to ignoring a crime against humanity that directly impacted a segment of the U.S. population, Americans of Armenian origin, and which implicitly supports Turkey's official policy of denial. I have opted primarily, although not exclusively, for a diachronic and chronological approach, starting with the massacres in 1915 to 1916, and even before. The first 5 parts of the book follow a chronological analytical approach, and discusses the main episodes of the United States' stance with regard to the genocide. This changes in Part 6, where I opt for a specifically thematic analytical approach that builds on the preceding parts to engage more broadly with the reasons for the United States' delayed recognition of the genocide. I decided to present the detailed chronological narrative before engaging in a discussion on causal arguments, because this analytical narrative is important per se, and most of it has not been discussed specifically in the academic literature, and because it is the best way to encourage the listener in a didactic and stimulating way to explore these causal explanations. The matter of the sources used in this study, whose temporal scope covers more than a century, is necessarily complex. In addition to hundreds of secondary sources, many primary sources have been used. Their volume and nature vary from one chapter to another. The first chapters, often shorter and synoptic, cover periods and episodes that have already been studied to a degree. The focus was thus mainly on the study of the secondary sources, supported by official reports and press articles from Armenian American and US outlets. For parts 2 and 3, the more recent the periods and episodes discussed, the more official documents, archival sources, and press documentation were used. For the study of the recent decades, I also used 25 semi-structured interviews I personally conducted with decision-makers and their staff, and lobbyists. The primary source material consists mostly of documents issued by the executive branch, reports, notes, presidential papers, etc., and Congress, principally from the congressional record and reports by congressional committees. Mainstream U.S. daily newspaper articles were used extensively, but the originality of this study in this domain rests in the use of nearly the entire collection of 2 Armenian American weekly papers, Hellenic Weekly, later Armenian Weekly, and Armenian Mirror Spectator. Both are organs of 2 major Armenian diaspora political parties, and represent different, often opposing political trends. As historical sources, they complement each other well. In the end, although I thoroughly studied hundreds of archival materials and other primary sources, I am fully aware that some other ones may exist and/or may be accessible in the coming years. These potential additional sources and their study will probably not modify the main conclusions of this work, but may refine the analysis of some situations and episodes studied in this book. Therefore, I do hope that this study, which is the first of its kind on this topic, will be followed by others, possibly focusing specifically on one or several of the many periods and themes that this book analyzes. Indeed, one of the main specificities of this work relates to the fact that the United States' positions and policies on the Armenian Genocide have been the subject of little scholarship to date. While several studies have been published on U.S. reactions during the massacres and their immediate aftermath, there are no analyses that scrupulously review the ways and the reasons the United States established and developed its ambiguous policy on the matter, and nobody has sought to analyze this policy over time as a single topic. In addition to my works, there are book chapters by Richard Hovannisian and Vigen Goroyan, published in the early 1990s, and sections of a book by Michael Babilian, in 2009. Yet these are relatively short studies focusing on specific time periods or themes. Approaching this topic in a more systematic and global way brings it within important academic and political debates, to which it can offer new perspectives. These debates concern diverse and significant questions that have often been examined thoroughly in academic spheres, such as the complexity and multifaceted nature of genocide denial, the role of human rights and ideals in shaping U.S. foreign policy, the importance of Turkey in U.S. foreign policy, the role of lobbies in forming U.S. foreign policy, the recurrent conflict between the President and Congress, the place of memory and remembrance issues in American life. When they are discussed, specifically in the media, the reasons and political processes that led the United States not to formally recognize the Armenian Genocide for over 50 years are often, if not always, examined through the lens of Turkey and U.S.-Turkish relations. The focus is on the fact that Turkey refuses to acknowledge the genocide, and therefore, as it is a major geopolitical ally of the United States, it is not in the latter's interest to oppose Ankara on this issue and to risk any cooling of bilateral relations. Although this point is central and will be discussed in this book, other causal arguments that are rarely discussed relating to the decision-making process in Washington, D.C., the importance of lobbies in this process, the force of inertia in certain institutions opposing recognition, especially the State Department, aspects of Washington, D.C.'s political culture, or the place of memory in U.S. political life, are important and will be addressed as well. To cover the complexity of the topic in the most exhaustive and comprehensive way, this 6-part study has 3 chapters per part. The first part presents the relations the United States had with the Armenians and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, during the first decades of the 20th century, and how it handled the Armenian massacres when they were committed and until World War II. The second part discusses the resurgence of the issue of the Armenian Genocide in the decades following World War II and how the United States handled it. The third focuses on the initial political struggles in the 1970s and 1980s of the Armenian Americans and their allies in Washington, D.C., to obtain formal recognition of the genocide by the U.S. government. The fourth part analyzes the continuation of this struggle in the 1990s and 2000s, and how polarization and tension developed and intensified between the Armenian camp and Turkey, the U.S. executive, and certain congresspersons successfully blocking recognition. The fifth part discusses the Obama, Trump, and early Biden eras, which corresponded to a gradual weakening of the non-recognition policy, leading to its reversal in 2019 to 2021. The sixth part analyzes in detail the geopolitical, political, institutional, and memory-related reasons why it has taken over 50 years for the U.S. government to recognize the Armenian Genocide. Part 1. The United States, the Armenians, and the Armenian Genocide before the Genocide Convention. Chapter 1. The United States and the Armenians prior to the Genocide. The emergence of certain bonds. The first encounters between the United States and Armenia date to the earlier half of the 19th century. They are relatively ancient for a young nation like the United States, though much more recent from the perspective of Armenia, whose history dates to around 900 BC. These initial encounters are important because, while they predate the genocide, they occasionally involved human rights issues, as Armenians were already in the 19th century regularly persecuted in the Ottoman Empire, of which most Armenians were subjects. As Armenia had not been a sovereign state since the Middle Ages, the initial interactions took place primarily through the policies of the United States toward the empire, the reactions of U.S. political circles and civil society to the treatment of Ottoman Armenians, and American missionaries who, from the 1800s, were active in the area. Exchanges also took place through the immigration of Armenians to America, the first significant waves of which occurred in the late 19th century. The early days of Armenian immigration to the United States. Martin the Armenian, likely a subject of the Persian Empire, is believed to be the first Armenian to have set foot on American soil. He settled in the Jamestown colony as early as 1618 or 1619, presumably as a governor's servant, although the Virginia Company's records showed that he also grew tobacco. He was naturalized as British, which makes him arguably the first naturalized person in North America, and left Jamestown in 1622. 30 years later, Martin was followed by 2 Armenians from the Ottoman Empire, one of whom was apparently known as George the Armenian. They were sponsored by Edward Diggers, landowner and prominent figure of Jamestown. Diggers sought to develop the culture of silk in Virginia, and his father, then British ambassador to Russia, knowing of Armenian skills in this field, recommended Diggers recruit them. These cases, and others in the 18th century, attest to an ancient Armenian presence on American soil, and are significant in Armenian-American culture and memory. Then, the Armenians arriving in the United States in the early 19th century were mostly students seeking to complete their education. The first such student was Khachik Oskanian. He arrived in New York in 1834, earned a degree in journalism, and became a reporter for the New York Herald. He lived in New York City, integrated, and welcomed other students, including Christopher Seropian, or Der Seropian, who arrived in 1842, and invented the die used in the manufacture of U.S. dollars. In 1854, there were about 20 Armenians living in the United States, and 70 in 1870. Most settled in New York, Boston, and surrounding areas. Some fought for the Union in the Civil War. Khachador Garabedian served as a Navy sailor for the Union and has been celebrated by Armenian Americans for fighting the Confederates. Other Armenians, medical students in particular, treated the wounded on the front. From the 1870s onward, Armenian immigration to the United States intensified for economic and political reasons relating to the persecution of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Many of these migrants initially came from the Kharput region, in the heart of Asia Minor, where U.S. missionaries were present and active, but Armenians flocked to America from all parts of the Ottoman Empire, and marginally the Russian and Persian empires, settling primarily on the East Coast. An early group of Armenians also made their way west in the early 1880s, settling in Fresno, California, which remains an emblematic Armenian stronghold in the United States today. In the 1880s, about 1,500 Armenians, mostly men, immigrated to New York and the Boston area. The factories of Worcester, Massachusetts, particularly attracted them. The first Armenian church in the United States was built there in 1891, the second in Fresno in 1900. At the end of the 19th century, although they were few in number, Armenians were well settled in America, in small, organized communities. This trend was confirmed with the arrival of many immigrants in the last years of the 19th century, and strengthened in the early 20th century. The 1890s were extremely difficult for the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. They were victims of the Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1896, carried out by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, named the Red Sultan in reference to these massacres. Some 200,000 Ottoman Armenians perished, officially in retaliation for activism in some Armenian circles to emancipate the Armenian people of the empire. These massacres aroused the indignation of world public opinion and weakened the Armenian nation, whose members were shocked and traumatized. Many Armenians emigrated, or, for those who were already on European or American soil, brought their relatives to join them, despite the reluctance of the Ottoman authorities to allow this emigration. Reluctance that may seem paradoxical, because they regularly persecuted the Armenian population. Armenians emigrated to various countries with high numbers to the United States, which became a first-choice destination. Between 1895 and 1900, an average of 2,500 Ottoman Armenians arrived on U.S. soil annually. Tens of thousands more arrived in the following years. In 1910, the Armenian-American population rose to 51,950. On the eve of the genocide, it was estimated at 60,000. These figures are small when compared to the entire U.S. population or to other ethnic groups, such as the Irish or Italians. But this immigration created solid Armenian communities. Armenians settled in cities on the East Coast, in Fresno, and progressively in the Midwest, with a concentration in Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Racine, Wisconsin. The communities benefited from the arrival of women and children. Places of worship, community centers, grocery stores, and cafes developed in areas where Armenians were numerous. Although many still hoped to return home, and some did so, Armenians integrated into American society. The integration was not always smooth. Bigotry and racism plagued Armenians, especially in areas where they were numerous, notably in places like Fresno, California, or Boston, Massachusetts. Armenians were restricted from joining certain clubs and organizations, excluded from living in certain areas, even after such discriminatory land covenants were declared illegal, and constrained in the professional education and their professional practice. Armenians sometimes suffered more specific racism in a society often encumbered by Orientalist cliches, less widespread in the United States than in Europe at the time, but still present, which portrayed Armenians as greedy, treacherous, or cowardly, similar to the caricatures of the Jews at the time, to whom they were often compared. As early as 1909, in the racialized political and social context of the era, the federal courts, in re Halagian, found that Armenians were white and not Asian, which was intended to limit discrimination against them, and, above all, make it possible for them to be naturalized. This decision was challenged in 1928 by the Ministry of Labor, which opposed the naturalization of Tados Kartosian, an Armenian immigrant, on the grounds that Armenians were not white. The federal courts agreed with the defense and closed the debate on the issue. This categorization as white, albeit disputed, was important in many ways, not least because it meant that Armenians, who were Christian, could assimilate into the dominant Anglo-European population. American missionaries, Armenia, and the Armenians. Christianity probably facilitated the relations between Armenians and Americans when Armenians decided to emigrate to the United States. But these relations were also strengthened in the Old Country because American Protestant missionaries were very active in the Ottoman Empire and developed a privileged bond with Armenians. American Protestants were not the only missionaries active in the region. They worked alongside European Catholics and Protestants, but they quickly spearheaded the movement. The development of their activities worldwide took place in the context of the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, corresponding to a period of strong renewal of the Christian faith in the United States. Most of their activities were led by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, ABCFM, created in Boston in 1810 at the instigation of the highest political and economic circles of the country. Elias Boudinot and John Jay, two founding fathers, were the first presidents of this organization. John Quincy Adams, also a founding father and the sixth president of the United States, was among the organization's early directors. The ABCFM sent its first missionaries to British India, then to other parts of the world, but quickly focused on the Middle East, the cradle of Christianity, and at the time part of the Ottoman Empire. When the first missionaries arrived on Ottoman soil in the early 1800s, their objective was to convert Muslims to Christianity. The task proved difficult. Under Ottoman law, Muslims were not allowed to convert. This failure led the missionaries to focus on the Greek population and the Armenians, who were Christian but faithful to degenerate churches of the East, as they were sometimes described in the West. Ultimately, 90% of the activities of American missionaries in the Ottoman Empire, up to World War I, targeted Armenians. The missionaries, many of whom were doctors, founded churches, orphanages, nurseries, and dispensaries. By the end of the 19th century, the assets of American missions on Ottoman soil were estimated at $4 million. Many of their activities were located in eastern Anatolia, still referred to as Armenia by global institutions and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?